India, India, India. Hey, you guys went to India yet? India. India tariffs to 50% from 25%. So y'all already got to know that we're charging India 25% tariffs on any product that comes into the United States of America. But India is also a heavy partner, trading partner, and they buy a lot of oil from Russia. All right. And so Trump doesn't like that because he's trying to leverage power and tariffs and things like that and isolating Russia in order to try to convince them to have a ceasefire so that we can stop having war between Russia and Ukraine. But in addition to that, they have not secured a trade deal. And so Trump is proposing to raise it another 25% to 50% on India. And so make sure y'all hit a like for the algorithm, subscribe to the channel with turn on your notifications. This is first a summary of the whole situation.
And President Trump is threatening to raise tariffs on Indian goods because of the country's business ties with Russia. It comes as he tries to put pressure on Vladimir Putin to end the war in Ukraine. And here's what the president said on CNBC this morning.
India has not been a good trading partner because they do a lot of business with us, but we don't do business with them. So we settled on 25%, but I think I'm going to raise that very substantially over the next 24 hours because they're buying Russian oil. They're fueling the war machine.
And CBS News White House reporter Olivia Rinaldi joins us now. Olivia, thanks for being with us. You know, President Trump has really seemed to have a very good relationship with the Prime Minister of India. How is India responding to all this now?
Well, India is calling these new threats unjustified and unreasonable. They say that they've been working with the White House on economic policy, and they don't see how they're buying a Russian oil, is really going to impact this. So President Trump says there's going to be a new tariff on Indian exports. The White House has not announced what exactly that will be. We are waiting to hear what that could potentially be, this new strict policy that they'll be putting on Indian goods. But you mentioned these two leaders had a pretty cordial and good relationship, but this comes as the president is trying to end that war in Ukraine by really tightening and squeezing the Russians' ability to export oil and gas.
And Olivia, President Trump spoke with Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky this morning. What came out of that conversation?
Well, we were able to confirm the call from the White House, but we heard a lot more of it from Ukrainian President Zelensky. He said that he spoke with the U.S. about coordinating positions in Ukraine, about how to deal with the Russians. They say they also talked about sanctions, and there was also a draft agreement on drone usage that the two countries talked about. This is, of course, from Zelensky's side. The White House did not confirm any of these details, but this comes as the president has said he wants to see an end to this war, and he gave Russia about a 10-day timeline to get some type of ceasefire deal to happen. We also know that Steve Witkoff, the special envoy to the Middle East, is in Moscow meeting with some of their leaders, and that meeting will happen tomorrow. So, Nancy, this could develop very quickly in the next 24 hours, some type of ceasefire resolution or conversation just between the two countries.
And Olivia, on another note, shifting gears here, Michigan's Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer met with President Trump at the White House today. Why was she there? And is there anything we should read into that meeting?
Well, I mean, optically, if you look at what's happening in Texas and Texas Democrats fleeing the country to go to Illinois and New York and seeking shelter there in those states so that they do not have to do the gerrymandering and the redistricting that they want to do in Texas. It's interesting to see Governor Gretchen Whitmer here at the White House, but her office says that the reason why they came here is to get concessions to stress to this White House that the tariff agenda and Medicaid policy are hurting Michiganders. She said she'll do anything she can to help the people in her state, even if that means working with this White House, which they don't agree with on a lot of policies. So she said there were several concessions she asked for today, including a delay on some of the changes to the state's Medicaid program. Also stressed to the president that the tariff policy impacts the automobile industry specifically in Michigan. That's a huge part of their industry, so it impacts those tariffs from Mexico and Canada, really hurts their GDP, their state's GDP. But certainly the timing of this meeting is quite notable with what we mentioned about Texas.
So the auto industry is catching hell, specifically the big three, because not only did they have to deal with the ratified agreement from the UAW and much higher wages and hiring permanent employees and so on and so forth, but they are also paying an egregious amount in tariffs And honestly, even though it's Michigan and even though I'm advocating for my state, they are now trying to use their relationship with Gretchen Whitmer, who is the governor, and a terrible government. Well, let me not say terrible. A governor that I don't necessarily agree with, and I think that she's ran the state very badly, especially during the pandemic. And I haven't never forgot about that. Thank God she has term limits, and so she can't run again. But they're leveraging their relationship with Gretchen Whitmer in order to get her to try to go over and get concessions from the Trump administration because they neglected to invest in the United States of America. And instead, they started to invest more in Mexico and in other countries. General Motors, they manufacture the majority of their Buick vehicles over in China. They have a large following and they have a very decent market for their Buick vehicles, but every Buick vehicle that you see here in the United States of America is largely manufactured and shipped over here from China. They invested a significant amount of resources in Mexico in order to build, manufacture, and assemble products in Mexico. And so what Trump is saying is that if you want to reduce tariffs, then you can just expand your capacity for the trucks that you build and for the vehicles that you build and sell to Americans here in the United States of America. It just is what it is. No, I'm going to put pressure on you. And so she's going to try to seek concessions on that front. She's going to try to seek concessions when it comes to Medicare. And I want y'all to understand when it comes to this whole Medicare situation, we get a lot of our funding. A lot of states get a lot of their funding from the federal government in the form of Medicare, Medicaid, government programs. And it's what makes a lot of these blue states dumb. Los Angeles, California, Colorado, Kathy Hochul over in New York, is because they are fighting against the Trump administration while at the same time they need the Trump administration and the federal government to continue to fund their state because they become interdependent on the federal government for a lot of the programs that either keep people employed inside of that state so that they can distribute the funds, or they leverage those funds in order to fill budget gaps and budget holes. So over in California, right, they seek a lot of their federal funding from the federal government, especially when it comes to the money that's being distributed for homelessness and even research facilities, the universities that then employ a lot of people that pay taxes inside of those states. And so when you see, I'll hear an argument. I'll give you an example. Mississippi is moving towards eliminating state property or state taxes, right? State taxes on your income. When you see, and people will get mad at the South and they'll get mad at certain places, and they'll say, well, a lot of the income that goes into the federal government comes from states like this, states like that. Well, a lot of the money that gets distributed over into those states comes directly from the federal government and from all taxpayers. And so they'll say, well, money from California actually helps red states, and that's why red states are so poor. Well, that's not necessarily true either. We distribute as taxpayers more money into the federal government that then gets distributed over into other states like the Californias. And so it doesn't necessarily come back to us. It gets distributed to the states where it has the largest population. And so if you have a lot of government workers in California, or you have a lot of universities over in California, they'll say, well, the majority of the taxes come from these people, but it's a pyramid because the taxpayers are spending money in order to keep you employed in states so that you can pay less taxes than you get from the federal government that then goes into your state in particular. And so we realize that. Whereas you could say, well, southern states or some of these red states aren't as prosperous, the Arkansas, the Mississippi, but then they become less dependent on the federal government. And that's where I think that the majority of companies are moving to. Is because it's not just based off of population, culture, environment, location. They are willing to relocate. And if you've never seen this before, all you got to do is look at the auto industry. The auto industry could have came into, and I'm talking about foreign automakers, the Daimlers, the Mercedes, the Audis, the Toyotas. They didn't come and build in the strongholds where all of the manufacturing capacity was. They went and built in the South. They didn't go and come up here and build in the North. where it was a lot of unions and unionization and all of that stuff. They weren't built in the South. And so there's a lot of companies that are starting to move down south. They're starting to move out of the Californias and into the Texases and the Mississippis and the places where they have a more business-friendly environment. The problem is, can you get people to live there and work there, and do you have a brain drain?
The governor of Texas is not only threatening to arrest...
Wait a minute. Wrong one. Where did that come from? Let me see if I can get the right one up. Give me a second. Is that the right one?
And President Trump is threatening to raise tariffs on Indian goods because of the country's business ties with Russia.
Mr. President, what kind of teeth, though, are in those investments? What kind of teeth are in those investments, meaning that would force the EU to make those investments? If they don't make those investments, what happens on the other side?
Well, then they pay tariffs of 35%. No, they brought down their tariffs. So they paid $600 billion, and because of that, I reduced their tariffs from 30% down to 15%. And a couple of countries came, how come EU is paying less than us? And I said, well, because they gave me $600 billion. And that's a gift. That's not like, a loan, by the way. That's not a loan that, 3 years comes up, we have to pay it back. There's nothing to pay back. They gave us $600 billion that we can invest in anything we want.
The deal that you
and nobody knows it, Becky. Nobody knows it because they don't know.
No, we have been trying to figure out the details on that, Mr. President. So
well, there are no
the
details.
Clarity on
the
that.
details are $600 billion to invest in anything I want. Anything.
Okay.
I can do anything I want with it. And the purpose was they've been, ripping us for so many years that it's time that they pay up, and they have to pay up. We couldn't afford to have the deficits. Look, I did something with Switzerland the other day. I spoke to their prime minister. The woman was nice, but she didn't want to listen. And they paid essentially no tariffs. And I said, we have a $41 billion deficit with you, madam. I didn't know her. I said, we have a $41 billion deficit, and you want to pay 1% tariffs. You wanted 1%. I said, you're not going to pay 1%. We lose. Because I view deficit as loss. You have some people. By the way, I think
pharmaceuticals are a big issue with Switzerland. I think.
Well, I'll go into pharmaceuticals. Yeah. They make a fortune with pharmaceuticals, and they make our pharmaceuticals in China and Ireland and everything else. And within the next week or so, we're going to be announcing tariffs on specifically. This is a separate class than the 15% tariffs on sort of everything. These are excluded classes, I call them. I like to call them excluded, like steel, aluminum, etc.
Right, the
well,
232.
We're going to be announcing on semiconductors and chips, which is a separate category, because we want them made in the United States. And by the way, they're being made in the United States. We have the biggest in the world, as you know, from Taiwan is coming over and spending $300 billion in Arizona, building the biggest plant in the world for chips and semiconductors. But on pharmaceuticals, we'll be putting a initially small tariff on pharmaceuticals. But in 1 year, President 1.5 years maximum, it's going to...
Why? Hold on, give me a second. Why do they keep trying to interrupt? It's almost as though they don't know how to interview or when they get a good guest on the phone. When you get somebody on the phone and they're trying to get their full thoughts out, or you get somebody to interview, you don't try to interject the show just, 25, 37. Shut up. And let the man talk. We didn't come to hear you. We came to hear Trump. Let him talk about exactly what they're negotiating, what they're talking about with Switzerland, what they're talking about with India, what they're talking about with Taiwan, why we are in a war with China for Taiwan in the first place, and why we're trying to proactively put ourselves in a position to not be interdependent on Taiwan, but instead the companies that are invested in Taiwan. Let him talk. Good God, shut up. Hate it when people do that.
Go to 150%, and then it's going to go to 250% because we want pharmaceuticals made in our country. And that's not the CHIPS Act like Biden did because he didn't know what he was doing, where they gave billions of dollars to companies that had more money than they knew what to do with.
President Trump, can I ask you about
Yes.
something that you're doing that's opposite of the Biden administration, too? And that's the latest
Everything.
deal that you've
I think
announced.
everything.
The latest deal, though, that you're announcing with India, you're upset with the trade deal there, especially because they're buying Russian oil. The Biden administration sanctioned Russian oil, but then they kind of winked and nodded and appreciated that India and China were buying some of that oil because they were worried it would raise oil prices and thereby prices at the pump. To you, is it more important to shut down the Russians on this than to worry about oil prices?
I'm not worried about prices because we're drilling at levels that nobody's ever seen before. And what Biden did is he stopped my drilling. And then prices, if you remember that first couple of months, prices went through the roof. And he immediately said, let's go back to what Trump was doing. Let's go back to it. But by that time, they had blown it, and the energy prices were so high, and that's what caused that, and his crazy spending is what caused, by the way, the largest inflation in the history of our country was during the Biden administration. Not 48 years. You know, they like to say 48 years. It was the largest in the history of our country, the inflation that we had during Biden, because the man obviously didn't know what he was doing. But with India, what people don't like to say about India, they're the highest tariff nation. They have the highest tariff of anybody. We do very, very little business with India because their tariffs are so high. So India has not been a good trading partner because they do a lot of business with us, but we don't do business with them. So we settled on 25%, but I think I'm going to raise that very substantially over the next 24 hours because they're buying Russian oil, they're fueling the war machine, and if they're going to do that, then I'm not going to be happy.
We had a lot of deals signed, and I don't know, I thought India was imminent. I'm not sure what the sticking point is there, Mr. President. But let's just, since we don't have all day, we got to talk China.
Well, the sticking point with India is that tariffs are too high. Now, I will say this. But India went from the highest tariffs ever. They will give us 0 tariffs. And they're going to let China, us go in. But that's not.
Oh, gosh. These people are absolutely annoying. They are annoying. So anyways, in conclusion, obviously it's just a straight up India is continuing to buy oil from Russia. And as a result, on top of the fact that we don't really do any business as far as us exporting over to India versus importing India products inside of the United States of America. And because they are already at a 25% tariff, India is crying and complaining, trying to get that down. Apple invested a significant amount of money in India. I also just recently got news that Apple plans to invest an additional $100 billion in order to shore up manufacturing inside of the United States of America because they're paying significant tariffs. And so I will keep you guys informed on what's happening out in these streets. CNBC, you guys, sometimes you do decent breakdowns, but you guys are horrible interviewers. Horrible interviewers. You keep trying to stop him. You making faces online. Look at this. Look at this idiot. Look at what is he doing?
But let's just, since we don't have all day, we got to talk China.
Well, why would you say that?
Sticking point with India is that tariffs are too high. Now, I will say this. India went from the highest tariffs ever.
I used to like you guys. Liberal Anton used to like CNBC. Liberal Anton used to like CNBC. I don't like what I'm seeing. It's not a fun situation. Anyways, let's continue on with the show. Just so dumb.